Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment, not because I am asking you to sleep, but because I want you to imagine something. Picture the deepest room in the largest building that has ever existed on the face of any world in the history of the human species. Now make that room 4 miles long and half a mile tall. Fill it from floor to ceiling with machinery, not the clean, sleek machinery of science fiction, but old machinery, groaning machinery, machinery built in layers on top of older layers, each generation of engineers adding their contributions on top of work they barely understood. Prayers and sacred oils mixed in with the grease, because understanding and faith became indistinguishable somewhere around the 3000th year of maintenance. Now wrap all of that in alchemical fog, so thick it sits on your lungs like wet cloth and smells of burned ozone and consecrated incense. Something sweet and terrible at the same time. And in the middle of it all, at the very apex of the churning apparatus, surrounded by stasis fields that shimmer like heat rising off a desert road, shrouded in power so dense it makes the air itself feel holy and wrong simultaneously. Put a throne. And on that throne, put a man, or what used to be a man. This is where the emperor of mankind has sat for more than 10,000 years. His body, once described in the oldest pre-heresy records as golden and towering, and so radiant that lesser men needed to shield their eyes just to look upon him directly, is now a crumbling ruin held together by technology and willpower in roughly equal measure. As the flesh, to the extent it still qualifies as flesh, has long since ceased to be what we would call skin. His organs have long since ceased to function the way organs are supposed to function. He does not eat. He does not drink. He does not breathe the way you and I breathe right now. He is sustained, in the most literal possible sense, by the daily sacrifice of up to 1,000 human beings, psychically gifted men and women who are brought before the Golden Throne, and who give their lives so that this thing, this ancient, terrible, broken thing sitting in the dark, can continue its work every single day for 10,000 years. I want you to sit with the mathematics of that for just a moment, because the numbers are staggering in a way that is hard to absorb all at once. We are talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 3.5 billion souls, give or take, offered up across the millennia to keep one body, one shattered, barely there body, from finally releasing its last breath. 3.5 billion people brought before a throne, their lives drained away like water from a bathtub, so that something can keep ticking. And that is not even accounting for the 10,000 psychers of the Adeptus Astronomica, who power the great lighthouse beacon of humanity's warp navigation, and who burn their own lives away in months rather than years. Each one a candle snuffed down to nothing so that warships across 70,000 light-years of space can find their way home. Think about that for a moment. Think about 1,000 people every single day who wake up knowing they will not see the sunset, who are brought through corridors in the depths of terror that have been walked by billions of people in the same direction over 10,000 years, all of them bound for the same destination. Some of them are terrified. Some of them, perhaps, are at peace. They volunteered for this, or they were found and selected and have had time to make a kind of accommodation with what is coming. Some of them are young. Some are old. All of them are gifted with something in their minds that most of the species lacks, that the Imperium's survival requires, and that the throne must consume to function. Their names are not recorded. Their faces are not preserved. The history of the Imperium does not remember them individually. Only the number matters, institutionally, 1,000 per day. The quota must be met. The quota has been met, more or less, as for 10,000 years. And yet, somehow, this is not the most horrifying part of the situation. The most horrifying part is that the Imperium of man, 1 million worlds, countless trillions of human beings, the largest single political entity in the history of all recorded life, functions because of this, because of him, because of the thin, guttering flame of a consciousness that has been sitting in that chair since the 31st millennium and showing, depending on who you ask and which source you trust, varying degrees of actual awareness of what is happening around it. Every regiment of the Astra Militarum that marches to war, every Space Marine chapter that launches from its battle barge, every astropath who reaches out across the void to carry messages between worlds, as every navigator who charts a course through the howling hell of the Imperium. All of it connects, in ways obvious and invisible, to the thing on the throne. Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes and the greatest single warrior in the Imperium's military hierarchy, keeps vigil outside the throne room. Not as ceremony, not as symbol, because something might try to get in. And the things that try to get in are not small concerns with small ambitions. They are the stuff of warp-spawned nightmare, entities that would unmake the psychic wards around the Imperial Palace and let the Eye of Terror, the warp gate that Magnus the Red accidentally tore open when he desperately tried to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, pour its contents out across the surface of Terror like a dam breaking. And the Custodes have not left Terror in meaningful numbers for 10,000 years. While the rest of the Imperium burned and bled and fought and fell, they stood watch here. All of that time, they stood watch. So when we ask the question, what if the Emperor wakes up? We are not asking a small question. We are not asking something with a clean or comfortable answer. We are pulling on a thread that is attached to everything. The entire edifice of human civilization in the far future is organized in ways large and small, obvious and buried, around the assumption that he sits on that throne and does not move. So what happens when he does? Let us find out together. And I promise you, the answer is stranger, darker, more complicated and more quietly beautiful than you might expect. Take a breath, settle in. We are going to be here a while, and every part of this journey is worth the time. Section 2, The Golden Throne. A prison built from a dream. Before we can understand what it would mean for the Emperor to wake up, we need to understand what exactly keeps him where he is and has kept him there for 100 centuries. Because the Golden Throne is not simply a life support machine, and the Emperor's situation is not simply that of a patient attached to a hospital bed. The reality is so much more complicated and so much more tragic than that picture suggests. The Golden Throne predates the Imperium of man itself. According to the most reliable sources available to scholars and tech adepts in the 41st millennium, it is a relic from the Dark Age of technology, that glittering, but terrible period in human history when humanity was at the absolute height of its technological mastery, when the species spanned entire star systems and the science of the age made the 41st millennium's most advanced knowledge look primitive by comparison. The Emperor, who was already ancient even then, having lived through recorded history in ways that most accounts only hint at, discovered the device in the sunken ruins beneath what had once been the continent of Asia. He had been drawn to this location by forces he understood, and some he admitted he did not. And when he found the device and understood what it was, he was not entirely certain whether the idea of using it had been entirely his own, and or whether the machine itself, in that strange way that truly ancient and powerful things sometimes seem to communicate with those sensitive enough to hear them, had participated in shaping the plan. The distinction troubled him. He was, above almost everything else, a man who needed to believe he was in control of his own mind. In its original form, the Golden Throne was a portal, not a life support system, not a communications amplifier, not the psychic engine it would eventually become, a portal into the webway. The webway, for those newer to the setting, is the transdimensional network built by the Aeldari civilization across the breadth of the galaxy over millions of years. It is a labyrinthine system of corridors and tunnels existing in the space between the physical universe and the warp, as allowing travel between points that would otherwise require dangerous immaterium transits, but without the exposure, without the demons, without the navigators and astropaths, and all the horrifying infrastructure humanity has built to survive the alternative. The Aeldari, used it as their primary method of travel during the height of their civilization. The Emperor wanted it for humanity. This was his great secret project. This was what he was doing in the depths of the Imperial Palace, while the Great Crusade was going on in the galaxy above him. He was sitting on the Golden Throne, holding open a portal into the webway and directing hundreds of thousands of Mechanicum workers as they expanded carefully into it, building new human-accessible corridors, mapping the ancient passages, reclaiming for humanity a gift that would have rendered the dangers of warp travel essentially obsolete. He imagined a webway with human sections running through it. He imagined a network that linked every world of the Imperium in an instant, creating not just an empire, but a truly unified species, one not separated by the weeks and months and years that warp travel still imposed, even with the Astronomicon burning to guide the navigators. No more ships lost to the warp. No more navigators burned out from years of staring into that horrible light. No more astropaths screaming in the night from what touched their minds in transit. This was the dream, and it required secrecy, because if the Aeldari had known what he was doing in their network, they might have tried to stop it. And if certain parties with a deep interest in the corruption of his greatest works had discovered it, they would have used the knowledge for exactly the purpose they eventually did use it for, which is, of course, precisely what happened. When Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the greatest psyker among all the Primarchs, the scholar warrior who had spent his entire existence pushing the boundaries of his gifts beyond what any other being had achieved, broke through the psychic wards of the Imperial Palace with a sorceress sending, he was not trying to destroy anything. He was trying to save his father. He had discovered the truth of Horus's betrayal, and he had no other way to communicate it quickly enough to matter. So he reached into his formidable psychic power, and he sent a message through the warp with everything he had, crashing it into the Emperor's carefully maintained defenses like a fist through a window. He did not simply violate a decree. He tore holes in the Emperor's psychic shields around the webway portal, and through those holes, things came, not slowly, not gradually, all at once, in numbers that overwhelmed the defenders immediately and kept growing. The Custodes and the Sisters of Silence fought with everything they had, burning their own lives in the defense of those corridors, and they could not hold the tide. The human-built section of the webway was lost, abandoned, sealed off permanently, and the Emperor had to remain on the Golden Throne, maintaining constant psychic pressure on the portal to keep it closed, because without his specific power holding it shut, what lay on the other side would come through, all of it, continuously. Just that was 10,000 years ago. What was originally meant to be a temporary measure, a brief interruption while solutions were found, became permanent when Horus dealt his killing blow on the bridge of the vengeful spirit. The Emperor returned from that encounter as something that was technically no longer alive in any conventional sense. He was reinstalled on the throne at his own instruction, and the machinery was modified to sustain not just the portal, but the remains of the man sitting above it. Malcador, the Sigillite, held the throne while the Emperor fought Horus, maintaining the seal through sheer force of a will that was second only to the Emperor's own in the Imperium. Malcador had been old when the crusade began. He had been burning away for a long time. Yet holding the throne for even those hours cost him everything he had left. He collapsed to dust when the Emperor returned. The Emperor, barely conscious, barely present, directed his final coherent will toward the machinery and sank into the state that the Imperium would come to call his sacred vigil. The Golden Throne therefore serves three distinct and interconnected functions simultaneously, and it is worth being clear about all three because they change everything about what it would mean for the Emperor to leave. First, it sustains his physical body, but using stasis fields and C-fusion reactors, whose operating principles have become so far beyond the understanding of even the most advanced Mechanicus tech priest that maintenance is performed through ritual as much as through any engineering principle that would be recognizable as such. Second, it provides the psychic foundation through which the Emperor directs the Astronomicon. He does not provide the energy for the beacon himself, That comes from the 10,000 psychers of the Adeptus Astronomica, burning their lives away in a chamber carved from the heart of a Himalayan mountain. But only his mind is powerful and stable enough to shape and focus that raw psychic energy into a coherent directional signal reaching 70,000 light-years across the galaxy, without him actively directing it, as the energy is present but unfocused, a lighthouse with no lens. Third, and most critically for this entire conversation, the Emperor keeps the webway sealed. If he ceases to hold that door closed, the Eye of Terror opens beneath the Imperial Palace. Not metaphorically, not as a gradual worsening of conditions, a warp rift, right there, at the absolute heart of humanity's greatest fortress, on the most populated and symbolically significant world in the Imperium. The Chaos Gods have been patient. They have been waiting for exactly this moment for 100 centuries. And here is the thing that haunts every conversation about the Emperor's eventual fate. The throne is failing. By the middle of M36, it had begun requiring more psycho-sacrifice to maintain its function than it originally needed. By early M41, as it required several times that original number. In the final decades of ME41, tech priests working in the depths of the palace reported failures in mechanisms so fundamental and so far beyond their ability to repair that they communicated their findings to the High Lords of Terror as a quiet, classified apocalypse. A countdown that could not be precisely timed, but whose arrival was no longer a question of whether, only when. Desperate measures were taken. Deals were made with the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, who understand the webway and its mechanics in ways no human engineer ever will. Those deals bought time, not salvation, not repair, just delay. So as you carry all of this forward into our thought experiment, hold on to one image above all others. The Emperor of mankind is not resting on that throne. He is not at peace. He is the stopper in the drain, and the drain leads directly to hell, and he has been standing on it for 10,000 years, while the drain gets wider, and his strength is not what it was. What does it take to lift him safely? What would actually need to happen for him to stand? That is the question at the heart of everything that follows. Section 3. How could he wake? The three pathways. When we talk about the Emperor waking up, there is a natural temptation to treat it as a single event with a single cause. A moment of dramatic reversal, a switch flipped, and then the story proceeds from there. But this is where the lore becomes genuinely interesting, because there are multiple mechanisms by which a return might theoretically occur, and each one produces a meaningfully different kind of Emperor, a different version of who or what steps out of that room and back into the galaxy. The nature of his awakening fundamentally shapes the kind of being he would be afterward, and therefore everything that would follow. The first pathway, and the one most grounded in the practical engineering of the setting, involves actually fixing the Golden Throne, not merely delaying its failure, the way the Drukhari bargain attempted, not patching it until the patch fails too, actually restoring it to full function, or better yet, replacing it entirely with something that does not require the Emperor's consciousness to be spent every hour of every day holding a specific door closed. This is, in broad theoretical terms, what Belisarius Cawl has been working on for over 10,000 years. Cawl is one of the strangest and most significant figures in the modern 40,000 setting. He has extended his life across millennia by distributing his consciousness across multiple cortical stacks, essentially backing up his mind the way you might back up important data, and cycling through areas of focus across centuries. He is not the same Cawl who existed at the beginning of the heresy in any simple, continuous consciousness sense. He is several thousand years of accumulated scientific thought in a single body, some of which remembers things in ways that he himself does not entirely trust. He was given a commission by Robert Guilliman at some point during or just after the heresy to do something that would give humanity options it currently lacked. Or what exactly he has built, what specific solutions he has found or is working toward, has been deliberately kept ambiguous by the law. But hints exist. He has been studying the throne. He has access to research and materials that no other human engineer possesses. And he is not a man who spends 10,000 years on a project only to produce a disappointing result. If Call succeeds, if the throne were repaired or replaced with something that could maintain the webway seal without requiring the Emperor's continuous active attention, then theoretically the Emperor might be freed from his primary obligation. What happens to his body after that is a separate question. He is, remember, a perpetual, one of that rare mutant branch of humanity with the gift of biological immortality and extraordinary regenerative capability. But perpetuals have survived things that would vaporize ordinary human beings. They come back from what should be terminal damage, over and over, because whatever mechanism underlies their gift operates below the level of consciousness and does not require their participation to function. The question is whether 10,000 years of the specific sustained damage the Emperor has taken, the wounds from Horus that were never properly healed, the constant psychic drain of maintaining multiple massive functions simultaneously, the slow deterioration of flesh that even perpetual genetics was never designed to counteract at this scale and duration, whether that can be walked back, whether there is enough foundation left for regeneration to work from. This is not guaranteed. It may not be possible. But it is the most logistically conceivable pathway, the one built from engineering problems rather than metaphysics. The second pathway is stranger, older, and pulls from some of the earliest and most evocative layers of 40K lore that the modern game has been quietly reintegrating, the Star Child. Understanding this pathway requires a brief detour into what the Emperor actually is at his most fundamental level. According to the oldest traditions in the setting, the Emperor came into being approximately 10,000 years before the far future setting, which means roughly 40,000 years before the Age of Strife and the founding of the Imperium, as the combined reincarnation of a group of shamans from humanity's prehistoric past. These were psychically gifted individuals who had guided and protected early human civilizations across tens of thousands of years of pre-recorded history, dying and being reborn in new bodies as each generation passed. Over those long ages, they came to recognize a pattern. They were dying faster than they could be reborn, because the nascent chaos gods, entities that had not yet achieved their full terrible power, but were growing stronger with every act of violence and desire and despair, were consuming their souls in the warp before they could complete the cycle of reincarnation. So they gathered together, all of them, every one of those ancient souls, and they performed a mass ritual. They sacrificed themselves collectively to create something new, something that would carry their combined purpose forward and be powerful enough to do what they individually could not. That something became the child who would eventually become the Emperor. Now, when the Emperor destroyed Horus on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, the act required him to access the absolute depth of his psychic power and his will in a way he had never been forced to before. He had to obliterate his son's soul entirely, not defeat him, not wound him, not send him fleeing back to the Chaos Gods, burn Horus from existence so completely that even the combined might of all four Chaos Gods working in concert could not find enough of him remaining to resurrect. That is a level of psychic destruction that staggers the imagination, and to access it, and the Emperor had to reach into himself and spend something that could not be easily recovered. Certain elements of his character, compassion, love, the capacity for warmth that had always made his most devoted followers love him even when his methods were harsh, were discarded or perhaps burned away as fuel in the moment when he needed to be nothing but pure will and pure destructive purpose. Those discarded elements did not cease to exist. In the warp, psychic things do not simply disappear when they are shed or severed. They drift, they gather, they find each other across the vast distances of the immaterium, drawn together by their shared origin, slowly coalescing over centuries into something coherent. This entity, this potential new consciousness built from everything the Emperor set aside when he had to become the weapon the moment required, is what the older lore calls the Star Child, or the Numen, or, in certain darker and more paranoid texts, the Chaos Child. because any powerful psychic entity accumulating presence in the warp is inherently touching dangerous territory regardless of its origins. The theory around this entity, held by a secret society within the Inquisition called the Illuminati, not a conspiracy theory, but a genuine faction composed of individuals who have survived demonic possession and emerged on the other side with a clarity of vision about the fundamental game being played in the warp, is layered and specific. When the Emperor's physical form finally fails entirely on the throne, what his soul should not be consumed by the Chaos Gods, who have circled him for 10 millennia, waiting for exactly this opportunity. Instead, through a ritual involving the sacrifice of the sensei, the Emperor's biological children, extraordinary and immortal human beings who have lived scattered across the Imperium since before it was founded, invisible to their father because their nature renders them effectively transparent to warp perception. The Star Child is catalyzed into full emergence. The Sensei Emperor is born, an emperor carrying the genetic and spiritual memory of the original, but having waited long enough and gathered enough of what was shed to finally be whole. Not the man who sat on the throne in the 31st millennium, something more complete than that. Something that might, in the most hopeful reading, be better. As this pathway was introduced in the earliest editions of Warhammer 40,000, when the setting was still finding its final shape, and then deliberately placed in the ambiguous middle ground of soft canon, neither confirmed nor refuted, present in the bones of the setting without being officially endorsed. The Horus Heresy novel series has been quietly reintroducing threads of it in updated forms. The End and the Death, the final volume of the Siege of Terror series, contains passages that gesture directly toward it. Whether it represents the actual direction of the meta-narrative is something that Games Workshop has been extraordinarily careful not to state definitively, because their relationship with the Emperor's potential fate is the most carefully managed narrative mystery in the entire setting. What the third pathway is perhaps the most primal and the most unsettling. The Emperor is a perpetual, and perpetuals do not stay dead. If the Golden Throne simply fails, catastrophically, completely, without the gradual decline being arrested by any technological solution, and the Emperor's physical form is finally released from its technological prison, there is a serious argument to be made that the perpetual gift would assert itself regardless. That the mechanism which had brought him back from near death dozens of times across 40,000 years of pre-imperial existence would claw its way back to expression even through this. He would not wake up as the man he had been. He would not wake up as anything that had existed before. What emerged would be a being who had gone into the warp as a barely alive consciousness, what endured 10,000 years of direct contact with the most dangerous forces in existence, maintained coherence through that contact through sheer will, and then came through the other side by means of a biology that was never supposed to be stopped permanently. The thing that woke up from that scenario would be the Emperor the way a river of lava is the mountain it came from. The same substance, fundamentally, but transformed by pressures and temperatures that nothing else in the physical world has ever endured. And it would wake up very, very angry, in the specific way that things are angry when they have been in tremendous sustained pain for an unimaginable length of time and have finally found a way out of it. Each pathway gives us a different Emperor. Each different Emperor gives us a different kind of first moment and a different set of cascading consequences. In all three of them, however, the galaxy on the far side is permanently changed. Let us begin with what happens the moment it occurs, regardless of how we got there. Section 4. The moment of waking. First hours on Terra. Imagine it from the perspective of someone standing in the hall of the Golden Throne when it happens. You are a custodian, one of the Adeptus Custodes, the golden armored warrior guardians created personally by the Emperor himself. Each one a warrior of such superlative individual capability that a single custodian is described in the text as an equivalent force to a full Space Marine company. You have stood this particular watch rotation for decades. Some of your brothers have stood watch here for centuries. Well, you do not sleep in any normal sense. You exist in a state of heightened readiness that most humans could not sustain for a week, sustained for lifetimes. Your aura-mite gold armor humming with the impossible psychic energies that radiate outward from the machinery surrounding the throne. The sounds of that machinery are so familiar that you have not consciously heard them in 100 years. They are the background of your existence. They define normal. And then something changes. It does not happen with thunder. It does not happen with light bursting from the seams of the throne's housing. It happens quietly, and that quiet is almost worse than any dramatic announcement could be. The machines change their pitch, not a failure signature. You know every failure signature, not an alert, no alarms trigger, a change. As the subharmonic rumble of the psi fusion reactors shifts to a frequency it has never operated at before, the alchemical fog moves against the usual current as if responding to a breath that should not be possible, and the stasis fields, those barely visible shimmering curtains of preserved time wrapped around the figure at the throne's center, that have maintained their exact same quality of shimmer for longer than any record in the palace extends, flicker. For the first time in 10,000 years, the stasis fields around the Emperor of Mankind flicker. A custodian does not panic. Custodians are constitutionally incapable of panic in the way a baseline human understands that word. But there is a communication sent, brief, coded, using a cipher so restricted that fewer than 40 living beings know it, pulsing through the internal networks of the Imperial Palace, and within minutes Trajan Valoris himself is moving through the corridors at a pace that even he, with all of his enhanced physiology, is pushing the edge of. The tech priests on duty register their anomalous readings and begin emergency protocols that have been kept in theoretical readiness for exactly this eventuality, despite the fact that no currently living member of the Order has ever genuinely believed they would need to use them. In offices throughout the palace complex, in the chambers of the High Lords of Terror, in the highest security channels of the Senatorum Imperialis, a series of notifications arrive, as some of the recipients read them and immediately call for their household staff to begin preparations for travel. Some of them sit very still for a very long time. One of them, a High Lord whose name the histories will argue over for generations, reads the notification and then reads it again, and then destroys the data slate entirely with a small device kept in their desk for occasions where information needs to cease to exist. In the Astronomicon chamber beneath the Himalaysian mountains, the 10,000 chosen feel it long before any official notification arrives. Those who are still capable of conscious thought, and not all of them are, also because the process of powering the beacon gradually reduces its participants to pure conduits over the course of months, feel it as a change in the nature of the connection between themselves and the mind that shapes their sacrifice into a signal. Something upstream of them has shifted. The connection is not weaker, it is more present, more focused, more alive, in a way that has no adequate description, because the sensation of an ancient mind suddenly becoming more fully itself is not something human language has a word for. The Astronomicon brightens, not by a small amount, by a degree that sends navigator guilds across the segmentum solar into controlled alarm, because a sudden significant increase in the beacon's intensity is not something their operational charts contain protocols for. It does not hurt them, exactly, to perceive it. But they were not expecting the equivalent of the sun abruptly doubling its intensity, and for the briefest of moments, hundreds of navigators across dozens of ships in the solar system simultaneously have to shield their warp-sensitive eyes. Then the Emperor moves, not dramatically, not the way a man leaps up refreshed from sleep. The movement is small, and it is everything. A finger, one finger, on the right hand, shifting on the armrest of the throne by perhaps half an inch. The joint accomplishes the motion. The tendon fires. The signal travels through something that is no longer quite muscle in any standard biological sense, but which still manages to produce motion when commanded. That finger has not moved in 10,000 years. The distance it travels might be measured in centimeters. But the distance it represents cannot be measured by any instrument that exists. In the Sanctum Imperialis, one of the attending tech priests drops a sacred instrument. The sound it makes on the stone floor echoes through the vast silence of the chamber with a clarity that feels obscene. Then a sound that none of them have ever heard before, that none of them will ever be fully able to describe to those who ask later, though many will try. The Emperor breathes in, not a gasp, not the dramatic sudden intake of breath from a hollow film resurrection, a slow, deliberate, controlled inhalation. The structures that serve as his lungs inflate, drawing in air that has been cycling through the hall of the Golden Throne for the entirety of the Imperium's existence. Air that tastes of incense and machine oil, and the particular static sweetness of psi fusion energy operating at close range. And somewhere in the vast corridors and chambers of the Imperial Palace, a tremor moves through the stone. Not structural failure, not seismic activity, the specific tremor that occurs when something enormous and fundamental that has been holding perfectly still for an unimaginable period of time, very slowly, very deliberately, shifts its weight. Trajan Valoris reaches the entrance to the Sanctum Imperialis and stops. He is not a man who stops without intending to. He stops because some part of him, the part that exists beneath all the conditioning and the centuries of service and the absolute devotion to duty, needs a moment, just a moment, to be fully, completely present in the weight of what he is about to walk into. He has spent his entire existence in the Emperor's service. He has spent it guarding the approach to a throne. He has never prepared in any concrete, emotional sense for the throne being vacated. He walks in. What passes between the Captain General of the Custodes and whatever the Emperor is in those first moments of genuine consciousness is not something any record captures fully. What we know is that the Custodes were made for this, in the deepest sense, not for the Emperor's protection, exactly, though that too, but for his will. They are extensions of that will in a way that even the Primarchs were not, because the Primarchs were designed to be independent leaders, to operate at interstellar distances with the autonomy that required. And the custodians were made to attend, to serve at the most intimate level. If any being in the galaxy is prepared for this conversation, it is Valoris. Within the hour, the most restricted astropathic communication in the entire history of the Imperium is composed and dispatched. It is 3 words long, in a cipher whose decryption key exists in fewer than a dozen living minds. 3 words that, when received at their destinations, cause every recipient without exception to stop whatever they are doing and begin moving toward terror. He has moved across the galaxy, or at least across the parts of the galaxy where the message can reach before the Astronomican's new brightness has already told anyone sensitive enough to notice that something fundamental has changed. The word begins to spread, not quickly. Well, nothing in the Imperium spreads quickly across interstellar distances, but it spreads with the kind of momentum that is not going to be stopped by anything short of the complete collapse of civilization. And even then it might find a way. Something ancient has woken up, and the galaxy will never be the same thing it was before. Section 5. The warp screams. Chaos responds. Nothing happens in the physical universe without the warp feeling it. The warp is not simply a parallel dimension through which warships travel by bending the laws of space and time. It is the psychic mirror of reality, the shadow that every thought and feeling and act casts into a medium that can hold and amplify them. When something truly significant occurs in real space, the reverberations in the warp are proportionate to the emotional and spiritual weight of the event. The Emperor beginning to stir, that signal, is not a ripple, it is not a wave, it is the psychic equivalent of a second sun igniting at the center of the solar system, and every entity in the warp that can perceive it, from the smallest imp demon clinging to the edge of real space to the ancient, incomprehensible entities called chaos gods, at the absolute center of their vast domains, perceives it simultaneously. They know him, every single one of them. They know him the way darkness knows a light, not by choosing to observe it, but because his nature defines what they are by opposition. The chaos gods call him the anathema, not as an insult, as a technical term. He is the opposing principle, order where they are dissolution, a singular coherent purpose where they are entropy and diffusion, and the endless appetite that can never be satisfied. He is what they fundamentally are not, and his power arises from precisely the qualities they cannot embody. They have been fighting him in the warp for 10,000 years, not in the way that armies fight, not with fronts and flanks and tactical positions, in the way that vast psychic entities fight, through sustained pressure.
Okay, I want to step out of the lore for just a second and tell you where I actually stand on this, because I have been sitting with this question for a long time, way longer than this video took to make. And my honest opinion, I don't want the Emperor to wake up, not yet. Not the way the setting currently sits. And I know that sounds strange coming from someone who just spent this long walking you through why it would be extraordinary, but here's the thing. The version of 40K where he still is on the throne, where everything is held together by the thinnest possible thread, where every hero is fighting in the darkness and it's doing so without any guarantee that the light at the center is still on. That version of 40K asks something of you as a reader. It asks you to find the meaning in the struggle without the resolution. And I think that is the harder and more honest story. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Through the wearing down of structures, through the gradual corruption of the spaces that border their domains, the Emperor's consciousness, spread thin across the Imperium in those 10 millennia, has not been passive. It has been working, warding, maintaining conditions, creating the psychic environment in which the Astronomicon can function without being overwhelmed by interference. They're pushing back against incursions that would otherwise have swallowed entire sectors of space whole. The four Chaos Gods have been pressing against that distributed consciousness from every angle for 100 centuries, grinding at it the way water grinds stone. Slowly, relentlessly, with essentially unlimited patience. And now, instead of weakening further, it is strengthening. Khorne, the blood god, the lord of battle and rage, and the skull throne built from the skulls of every warrior who ever died, feels it first, and his reaction is the most straightforward. He wants to fight the Emperor. He has always wanted to fight the Emperor, not because he expects to destroy him, not primarily, but because the Emperor is the only opponent left in the galaxy who is genuinely, satisfyingly worthy. His greater demons, the Bloodthirsters, as are described in various sources as the most powerful individual entities Chaos can field in real space, and the Emperor at full power made one of them look like an irritation during the Horus Heresy. The Blood God's reaction to an Emperor who has risen from 10,000 years of imprisonment is not fear. It is anticipation, in the specific form that anticipation takes in the Blood God's domain, a massive, building, world-shaking surge of violence pressing against the boundary between the warp and real space. Tzientch, the architect of fate, the changer of ways, that endlessly calculating, endlessly plotting, utterly alien intelligence that above all things is defined by its relationship with change and possibility, and the infinite branches of what might be, reacts in a way that is far harder to categorize. Tzientch feeds on change. Oh, complexity, uncertainty. The previous status quo, the Emperor on the throne, the Imperium grinding forward in its long, managed decline toward eventual catastrophe, the slow grinding victory of entropy, is exactly the kind of long-term stable state that Tzientch finds relatively uninteresting after the first few millennia. The disruption of that equilibrium is, in some genuinely twisted sense, potentially gratifying to the changer of ways. This is the kind of change that reshapes everything, every thread of fate that Tzientch has been following for 10,000 years suddenly branches in new directions, and some of those new branches are genuinely unpredictable, which is itself deeply interesting to an entity whose primary characteristic is omniscient calculation of possibilities, and yet, as a fully restored Emperor, represents an opposing force of such magnitude that Tzientch's endless webs of possibility modeling become, for perhaps the first time in millennia, genuinely difficult to fully resolve. There is a reason the architect fears the Emperor, more than he fears any other single entity in the physical universe. An emperor at complete consciousness does not simply resist Tzeentch's manipulations. He operates at a level that makes those manipulations measurably less effective, because his own comprehension of fate and possibility is not as broad as Tzeentch's, but is pointed with an intensity that cuts through the noise. Tzeentch's plans begin multiplying and branching and contradicting each other in the modelling, and the Lord of Change does something he does rarely and with deep discomfort. He pauses. The Plague Father, the Lord of Decay, the entity that embodies simultaneously the process of rot and the peculiar bloated love that underlies all of it, has the most clearly fearful reaction among the four. Nurgle's power grows when hope diminishes, when civilizations stop believing in recovery and simply endure their suffering without expecting it to end. The Imperium in its current state, grinding forward, decaying institutionally, still fighting back but no longer really believing in victory, just in continuation, has been one of the Plague Father's great unintentional gifts. The taste of people who have stopped expecting improvement but cannot quite stop existing is deeply nourishing for the Lord of Decay. And it is the specific flavour of despair that does not quite tip over into the suicidal variety that chaos occasionally produces, and that ends things too quickly to be useful. An emperor who wakes up and begins acting in the world represents the possibility that people might start believing in recovery again, in genuine, significant recovery, not the small-scale heroism that keeps individual worlds fighting despite everything, but systemic improvement at the level of the entire species. Nurgle understands, in whatever way a being composed of living pestilence understands things, that hope of that scale and intensity is existentially threatening to everything he cultivates. His response begins forming in the depths of his domain. Mortarion, the demon Primarch of Nurgle and the Lord of the Death Guard, but is almost certainly already drafting the outlines of something in response. He has a personal hatred for Guilliman that 10,000 years have not diminished. The prospect of that brother's cause being dramatically strengthened is not something Mortarion will accept passively. Slayanesh, the Dark Prince, the Lord of Excess, born from the catastrophic collapse of the Aeldari civilization's indulgences, reacts with the specific hungry curiosity that characterizes the way the prince engages with everything interesting. The Emperor has spent 10,000 years as something Slanesh cannot easily reach. His psychic presence is so fundamentally opposed to the nature of chaos that the usual approaches, the whispered temptations, the slowly awakened desires, whilst the gentle corruption that works so well on lesser beings, are about as effective against him as paper against stone. But a walking emperor is a different proposition than a throne-bound one. An emperor who must navigate a world that has become deeply, profoundly wrong under his absence, who might feel grief, who might feel guilt, who might carry the specific, complex suffering of someone who built something magnificent and then watched it become a monument to everything he opposed. These emotional states are not weaknesses Slanesh can necessarily exploit in him, but they register. They feed the warp. And the Dark Prince finds the complexity of an ancient, powerful mind in genuine anguish, aesthetically compelling. All four of the Chaos Gods, but despite the great game that keeps them perpetually at each other's throats in their own domains, redirect a meaningful portion of their attention toward terror in those first days after the Emperor stirs. Not enough to end the great game, nothing ends the great game, but enough to change what the war at the edge of the solar system looks like. The pressure on the Astronomicon, the nature of the incursions probing the Eye of Terror's boundaries, the activity of their mortal servants and their daemonic legions throughout the galaxy, across the Eye of Terror and the Maelstrom, across every demon world and warp rift, where the fallen servants of chaos maintain their eternal vigil. The word spreads in the way that things spread in the warp, without words, through the medium of psychic resonance, through the way a struck bell transmits its tone to every other bell in proximity. Even the damned can feel it, especially the damned the Chaos Space Marine legions begin receiving communications that have been waiting in preparation for exactly this contingency, sealed and encoded and ready to deploy. 10,000 years of preparation for the possibility that the anathema might return. Abaddon the Despoiler, who has fought 14 major crusades against the Imperium over the millennia, and whose strategic intelligence is not to be underestimated, is not caught off guard. He has contingency plans for contingency plans. He is already moving. The galaxy breathes in, and what it exhales is the beginning of the most significant conflict since the Horus Heresy itself. And Section 6. The Imperium fractures. Faith, politics, and the weight of an absent god. Here is a question that I want to plant in your mind early and let grow while we move through this section. What happens to an institution that has been built over 10,000 years on the foundation of someone's absence when that person suddenly returns? The Imperium of man was not always the theocratic, militaristic, faith-saturated civilization we know from the 41st millennium. There was a time, at the beginning, during the Great Crusade, during the ages when the Emperor walked and spoke and led personally, when his vision was something very different. He called it the imperial truth, a secular, rationalist framework for understanding reality. He was explicit about it. No gods, no worship, but no faith in supernatural forces, because such faith had kept humanity small and frightened and vulnerable through the entire age of strife. He hated, and it is rare to use the word hate about the Emperor because his emotional life is deliberately obscured, but this specific thing seems to have genuinely reached that intensity. He hated the idea of being made into a religious figure. He was a scientist first, a strategist second, and a tyrant reluctantly. He had spent his entire existence fighting against the kind of superstition he saw as one of humanity's primary weaknesses. He told his son Lorgar this directly, in the most publicly humiliating way possible. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, had spent his own existence creating a faith around the Emperor's divine nature and spreading it across every world his legion brought to compliance. The Emperor did not simply ask him to stop. He sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Monarchia, the most sacred of Lorgar's cathedral worlds, and had it burned to the ground. Then he stood Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion in front of the ashes and told them they had disgraced themselves. He wept Lorgar, openly, in front of his legion, and then he channeled that devastation into something much darker, and the rest of that story ends badly for everyone. That act, and that principle, and that explicit rejection of divine status, that is what the ecclesiarchy was built in contradiction of. The Adeptus Ministorum, the Church of the God Emperor of mankind, as is the largest religious institution in the galaxy. It has burned heretics by the planet full in the name of a man who told his most devoted son that faith in him was a mistake. It has waged crusades for which he never called. It has written doctrine he never approved. And it has done all of this for 10,000 years in the specific power vacuum created by his absence. And the really complicated thing is, the faith is real. The miracles performed by the Sisters of Battle in the Emperor's name are real events in the lore, not explained away as coincidence or misinterpretation. The saints of the Imperium genuinely manifest psychic power attributed to the Emperor's will. There are documented interventions in battles and crises that should not have been survivable. Show whether this represents the Emperor's actual intervention or whether it represents the collective psychic power of billions of believers creating real effects through sheer spiritual force. And in a setting where the warp is the reflection of emotion and belief, those may not be entirely different things, is deliberately unresolved. The faith created something real in a galaxy where belief has physical consequences. So when the Emperor wakes, this reality creates a fracture that runs through the entire ecclesiarchy. For genuine believers, people who have given everything to their faith, whose entire identity and purpose is built around their devotion to the God Emperor, his return is the fulfillment of every prayer they have ever offered. They will fall to their knees, and they will weep. And they will be the lucky ones in the theological sense, because their faith will be met with the actual presence of its object. Whatever adjustment has to be made in the next generation to reconcile the living emperor with the doctrine of the dead one, it begins from a foundation of genuine encounter rather than institutional crisis. But there are people within the ecclesiarchy and the Imperium's governing structure for whom the emperor's absence is not incidental to their power. It is constitutive of it. The High Lords of Terror rule because they interpret his will. They interpret his will because he cannot speak directly. If he can speak directly, they do not interpret anymore. They receive orders. The shift from the former to the latter is not a small administrative adjustment, as it is the complete transformation of the political structure of a civilization governing 1,000,000 worlds and countless trillions of human beings. The people currently occupying those positions of interpretive authority are not going to accept that transformation without considerable turbulence. Some of them will be sincere in their concern, not merely self-interested, genuinely worried about what direct imperial rule would mean for a civilization that has evolved over 10,000 years specifically without it. The Imperium, for all its failures, has developed institutional structures that function, not well, not fairly, not humanely, but they function. An emperor who wakes up and immediately begins dismantling those structures, even with the best intentions, could destabilize something that survives primarily because of accumulated institutional inertia rather than any rational design. This is a real concern, not just a cover story for power preservation. Others will not be sincere. They will simply be calculating, and some of those calculations will lead, very quietly and very quickly, to the question of whether the emperor is controllable, and if not, whether the emperor is manageable, and if not, whether the emperor is, the word that none of them will say out loud, but that will be present in the room, a problem. The Inquisition is in a particularly unique kind of crisis. The mandate of the Holy Orders of the Emperor's Inquisition is, at its broadest, the protection of humanity from everything that threatens it from within and without. For 10,000 years, that mandate has been carried out in the Emperor's name and under the broad authority of his presumed will. An emperor who can now express his own will directly changes the basis of inquisitorial authority in ways that are not simple to resolve. There are inquisitors from the Puritan factions who will greet the emperor's return as the greatest possible validation of their methods and beliefs. There are inquisitors from the radical factions who have spent their careers suspecting that the rigid orthodoxy of the Imperium was itself one of the primary problems, and who will see the emperor's return as the long-awaited moment when that orthodoxy can finally be challenged by the authority that created it. These two groups will not agree on what to do with the new situation. They never agree on anything. But the Space Marine chapters have their own internal reckoning, 10,000 years of tradition built on the Codex Astartes, and the specific theological framing of the Emperor as simultaneously genetic father and divine protector. The Black Templars, whose entire chapter identity is built around the Eternal Crusade, the belief that through endless war they prove their devotion and potentially accelerate the Emperor's return, are the obvious case. When he actually returns, the Eternal Crusade loses its eschatological justification, and 10,000 warriors who have never done anything else have to figure out what they are for. This is not a small identity crisis. This is the kind of existential questioning that chapters have gone to war over before, in less dramatic circumstances. And then there is the ones who simply will not believe it, because the Imperium's history is full of false prophets and chaos-backed imposters and heretical claims of divine revelation. The proper trained instinct of every imperial servant toward any such claim is extreme skepticism that begins in the vicinity of hostile investigation and goes from there. The first inquisitor who receives the news will not feel wonder. They will feel their hand moving toward their bolt pistol and their mind moving toward a very specific list of questions. Who benefits from this claim being true, and are those the same people making it? The Terminus Decree makes all of this sharper and more dangerous. The Grey Knights carry standing orders from the Emperor himself, predating the 41st Millennium, order written when he was still capable of writing such things, that state, clearly and without qualification. If the Emperor returns in a state that suggests corruption, if what walks out of the throne room is not what walked in, if 10,000 years of warp exposure have transformed the anathema into something that now serves the enemy he spent his existence opposing, then the Grey Knights are to destroy it, not attempt to contain it, not refer the matter to the High Lords, destroy it. These are the Emperor's own orders about himself. They cannot be overridden by Guilliman or any other authority. They are the most serious contingency plan in the galaxy, written by the only person with the standing to write it. The Grey Knights will be watching from the moment the word spreads, and everything that walks out of that room will be examined with every psychic test available to the most highly trained demon hunters humanity has ever produced. And that examination will not be complete quickly, and during the time it takes, the question of what authority the returned Emperor actually holds will be genuinely, practically uncertain. All of this crisis, theological, political, military, institutional, begins simultaneously, not in sequence, all at once, within hours of each other, across a galaxy that was already handling more catastrophe than it was designed for. The Imperium has always been a civilization living permanently on the edge of collapse. The Emperor's return does not pull it back from that edge. It changes the shape of the edge entirely, which may ultimately be the same thing as pushing it off. Or Section 7, Guilliman and the Emperor, a father's silence, a son's fury. There is no single relationship in the 41st Millennium more charged, more complicated, or more raw than the relationship between Reboot Guilliman and the Emperor of Mankind. Not the relationship between Horus and the Emperor, which ended in fire and tragedy and the defining catastrophe of the setting's entire history. Not the relationship between Magnus and his father, which burns with the specific anguish of a child who acted from love and was destroyed for it. The Guilliman situation is the one that feels most present and most alive in the modern lore, because Guilliman is here, now, actively trying to hold something together that was left broken, and his feelings about the person who left it that way are not old history. They are current and complicated and enormous. Guilliman returned from 10,000 years of temporal suspension, mortally wounded by Fulgrim at the Battle of Thessala in the early 31st Millennium, placed in stasis, sitting frozen on a throne of his own on Macragge, as a steady stream of pilgrims made the journey across the galaxy to weep at the feet of the frozen son of the god, carrying an enormous amount of hope. He had loved his father, in whatever form love can take between a 40,000-year-old psychic demigod and the superhuman general he created as a tool and a son simultaneously. He had believed in the Imperial truth, in the project, in the idea that what the Emperor had built was worth carrying forward. He arrived on Terra in the middle of the worst crisis the Imperium had seen since the heresy itself, walked into the Sanctum Imperialis, and stood before his father for the first time in 10,000 years. What happened in that room is one of the most carefully managed mysteries in the modern 40K narrative. The Dark Imperium novel approaches it obliquely, giving us a Guilliman who walked in with questions and walked out with something darker and more complicated than any answer he had hoped for. What we can piece together is this: the Emperor did not greet him, not in any human sense. He did not acknowledge the weight of the reunion, the 10 millennia of absence, the grief and hope and disillusionment that Guilliman had carried into that room. Was he treated his son precisely as he had always treated his sons, at the most fundamental level, as a capacity, a tool, something to be deployed toward a purpose? He blasted Guilliman's mind with information. The experience was described as something that nearly broke even a Primarch's consciousness, not through malice, but through sheer overwhelming force. The Emperor's psychic presence, having spent 10,000 years fighting in the warp at levels no human was ever meant to operate at, has become something that a Primarch's mind can barely withstand at full intensity, let alone receive communication from without significant distress. Guilliman emerged from the meeting visibly shaken. He declared himself Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent by the authority of that meeting. He launched the Indomitus Crusade. And then, as over the following years something became apparent in what he said and what he wrote and what he chose when choices had to be made, he stopped fighting for the Emperor. Very quietly, very carefully, but unmistakably, he started fighting for humanity, for the people of the Imperium, not for the thing on the throne, not for his father, not for the divine will that the ecclesiarchy spent its energy interpreting. In a pivotal confrontation with Mortarion during the Plague Wars, a battle that nearly killed him, that would have killed him without the Emperor's intervention from the throne, Guilliman's response to his traitor brother's challenges about loyalty was specific and deliberate. He fights for mankind, not for the Emperor, for the people. Was this is the Lord Commander of the Imperium, telling anyone paying attention that he may be wielding the Emperor's authority without sharing the Emperor's allegiance in the way that authority would traditionally imply. He is genuinely angry. He is genuinely disillusioned. He is genuinely committed to doing the work regardless of whether the being on the throne approves of his specific methods. He has accepted the role of steward for something he has serious reservations about, because the alternative, stepping back and letting the structure collapse, is worse. Now the Emperor wakes up. Guilliman will be summoned immediately. He is the Lord Commander, the closest thing to someone who can actually manage this situation. He will travel to Terra, and he will walk into the Sanctum Imperialis. And this time the meeting will be different in ways both parties will feel before a word is exchanged. Last time, Guilliman came as a petitioner, stunned and hopeful. This time, he comes as the man who has been running the Imperium, who has carried decisions of incomprehensible weight, who has made choices in the dark that he knows his father would have found at least some of questionable. He comes as someone who has earned the right to be in that room, not through birth, but through demonstrated responsibility. What he feels in that room will be a knot that does not resolve easily. Relief, because for all his disillusionment, the Emperor's recovery is genuinely good for humanity, and Guilliman genuinely cares about humanity first. Anger, the specific, cold, controlled variety that belongs to someone who has been doing an impossibly difficult job on behalf of a person who is not available to do it themselves, and who has some questions about whether that unavailability was as purely involuntary as it appeared. Grief, for the father he thought he had, or hoped he might find in that first meeting, and did not. And underneath all of that, the thing he would be least comfortable naming, the desperate, fragile hope that this time, in this meeting, with the Emperor perhaps more present and more himself than he was in that first awful encounter, the conversation might go differently, that the father he needed might actually show up this time. The Emperor is not built for the conversation Guilliman needs. He never was. He has always been constitutionally, fundamentally limited in certain ways that have nothing to do with intelligence or capacity or care, and everything to do with the specific way his mind was formed by 40,000 years of being the most powerful and most isolated consciousness in the galaxy. He cannot give his sons, his living, suffering, desperately hoping sons, the acknowledgement they have needed from him. This is not cruelty. It may be something worse than cruelty. It may be genuine limitation in a being who is extraordinary in almost every other respect. And Guilliman, who has made peace with most of what he cannot change, may find that this particular thing is still not fully at peace in him. The other living Primarchs each bring their own version of this complicated inheritance. Lionel Johnson, he recently returned from his own long sleep in the depths of the rock, carries the weight of a different kind of wound. The Dark Angel's 10,000-year secret, the fall of Luther, the fallen angels scattered across time and space. Johnson is characterized by duty and control and the specific emotional suppression of someone who carries enormous things and has learnt to do so without visibly bending. He may actually be better equipped than Guilliman for the complexity of this meeting, not because he has less to feel, but because he has practiced not being overwhelmed by it. Vulcan, the perpetual Primarch, the only one of the original 21 who shares the Emperor's own fundamental nature, may be the one who understands what came back from the throne most intuitively. Two perpetuals in the same room, others having both survived things that should have ended them, having both been transformed and returned. There may be a recognition between them that bypasses the complications of father and son and simply meets as what they both are, beings who have been in the fire and come back and kept going. And the question of which Primarchs are even alive to respond, and what each of them brings to the moment when they learn their father has finally moved. That question spreads outward like ripples, touching every corner of the setting. There is another dimension to this that is easy to overlook when focusing on the emotional and relational aspects. The political dimension of Guilliman's position specifically. Guilliman is the Imperial Regent. He rules in the Emperor's name, with authority that was bestowed in the most explicit possible way by the Emperor himself from the throne directly into Guilliman's mind during that terrible first meeting. That authority has been the foundation of everything he has done since. The Indomitus Crusade, the Primaris program's deployment, the reforms of the Astra Militarum, the cautious modernization of imperial governance structures that has been happening slowly and without announcement because announcing it would immediately mobilize opposition. When the Emperor wakes, Guilliman's authority does not disappear, but its basis changes entirely. He is no longer the regent of an incapacitated emperor, interpreting a will that cannot be directly expressed. He is the Lord Commander of an Imperium, whose supreme authority has just returned to active status. With everything he has done in the years since Guilliman's return has been done on the assumption of his own judgment in the Emperor's absence, and some of those decisions, particularly the ones involving Xenos cooperation that would have been unthinkable under strict imperial doctrine, the decisions around the Inari, the pragmatic allowances made for unconventional methods during the Plague Wars, are decisions that a fully conscious emperor might view very differently. Guilliman knows this. He has to know this. And the particular kind of confidence he would need to carry his accumulated record of decisions back into the room with his father and stand by them, as and explain why each one was the right choice given what he knew and what was available. That confidence is either the foundation of something extraordinary between them or the source of the most consequential argument in the history of the Imperium. There is also the question of the Primaris Marines themselves. Belisarius Cawl developed them based on the Emperor's original genetic templates, extended and refined over 10,000 years using methods that were, to put it diplomatically, operating at the boundary of what the Emperor had authorized when he gave Cawl his original commission. The Primaris represent both an extraordinary act of loyalty to the Emperor's original vision of what Space Marines could be, and an act of considerable presumption about how that vision should be developed in his absence. Which, when the Emperor sees them, really sees them, with full awareness of what Cawl did and how, his reaction will establish something about whether the 10,000 years have made him more flexible about such initiatives or less. If more flexible, if the returned Emperor is the version of himself who has learned from the catastrophic consequences of demanding too much rigid compliance and not enough independent initiative from the people around him, then Cawl's work will be recognized as the extraordinary achievement it is and built upon. As if less flexible, if the throne's long vigil has produced someone who has spent so much time in the abstract space of psychic war that individual human decisions feel presumptuous rather than praiseworthy, then one of the most significant developments in the Imperium's recent history becomes a source of tension rather than pride. Guilliman will be watching that reaction very carefully, because Guilliman spent years working alongside Cawl, directing the Primaris program's deployment, making the case for its value against considerable institutional resistance. If the Emperor dismisses or criticizes Cawl's work, he is by extension dismissing or criticizing Guilliman's judgment, and Guilliman's patience with being treated as a subordinate whose judgment does not merit respect has been considerably tested over the years since his return. So the relationship between father and son, between the Emperor and this most dutiful of his living children, may be the most important single relationship in the first years of the Emperor's recovery, and it is already carrying an enormous amount of weight before the first word is spoken. Section 8. The Emperor sees his creation, the weight of 10,000 years. Here is what I believe is the most quietly devastating element of this entire scenario. More devastating than the political upheaval. More devastating than the chaos response. More devastating than the military implications, or the theological crisis, or the institutional fracturing. More devastating even than the complexity of the reunion with Guilliman. The Emperor has been watching. Not in every detail. The throne was failing, his consciousness was spread thin across the warp fighting battles at a level we can barely conceptualize, and his physical senses have been as functional as the rest of his body for most of those 10,000 years, which is to say, not very. But he has been present in the warp. The warp reflects reality. Events of sufficient significance reach him in ways that cannot be fully controlled or filtered. He has known, in the broad strokes and sometimes in more specific ones, what has happened to his Imperium, the faith built in his name that he never wanted, the church built on what he explicitly, publicly, humiliatingly forbade, the burning of knowledge in his name by institutions he created specifically to preserve knowledge, was the 10,000 years of wars fought in his name against enemies who exist in large part because of decisions he made, by warriors shaped by doctrines he never approved, in the service of goals he would not have recognized as his own, and the Horus heresy. Above all else, the heresy. He knew it was coming. He had seen enough of the future to know that something terrible was building around Horus, and his specific choice in response to that knowledge, to remove himself from the Great Crusade and work on the Webway project in secret, trusting Horus to continue the crusade without understanding why his father had stepped back, is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of fiction. Whether keeping Horus closer would have prevented the heresy is unanswerable, was whether being more honest with his sons about what he was doing and why, what he was planning, and for what ultimate purpose, might have changed the dynamic that allowed chaos to find purchase in so many of them. That question haunts the entire setting. He knows it. He has had 10,000 years to sit with it in the closest thing to solitude that an entity fighting the chaos gods in the warp can experience. 3.5 billion souls sacrificed to keep him alive. 4 Primarchs lost in the heresy. Half the Space Marine legions turned traitor. The Webway project destroyed. Terra itself nearly lost. And then 10,000 more years of everything that followed from the state the heresy left the Imperium in. That is the accounting that waits for him when he can finally face it fully, not as data arriving through damaged senses, but as the reality he walks back into. He will see the psychers burned at the stake, not just the dangerous ones, the uncontrolled ones, the ones who genuinely need to be handled, but the ordinary gifted humans, the ones who might have been astropaths or navigators or sanctioned psychers, contributing meaningfully to the Imperium's functioning, who die in screaming terror because the ordinary population's fear of the warp has been institutionalized into witch-burning doctrine over the course of millennia. He created the system that was supposed to gather and train these people safely. What it became is something he would find horrifying. He will see the worlds of knowledge that were burned, not just during the age of apostasy and the worst periods of institutional madness, but as a continuous, low-level process throughout the entire age. Libraries destroyed because knowledge is suspect. Scientific inquiry suppressed because it challenges received doctrine. Technological development arrested, not because technology is bad, but because the Mechanicus has made technological innovation a religious matter requiring specific authorization. He believed in knowledge as the primary tool of human liberation. He built libraries. He opened universities. He established the remembrances to record and preserve the history of the Great Crusade. The Imperium that persisted in his absence burned libraries. But he will also see things that are better than the worst reading of the situation would suggest, and I think it is important to sit with those as well. Because the Emperor waking up to nothing but failure and horror would be both too simple and too unfair to the people who kept things going. He will see the Space Marines, not the legions he imagined, not the 20 grand armies of superhuman warriors he spent decades creating from nothing. Those were shattered and scattered and transformed across the heresy. What he will see is 10,000 chapters, each a smaller and more independent expression of what a space marine can be, distributed across every corner of the Imperium, each one carrying some fragment of the gene seed he designed and the ethos he instilled, each one imperfect and each one stubbornly, incredibly still fighting. They did not break. 10,000 years of unrelenting war against enemies that should have overwhelmed them multiple times over, and they did not break. Yet he made them. Whatever they became in his absence, the fundamental quality he put in them, the refusal to stop, the commitment to humanity's survival as a principle that overrides personal cost, that held. He will see the ordinary people of the Imperium, the guardsmen who die by the hundreds of millions in wars for planets they have never seen and will never see again, not because they are compelled in every case, but because the alternative is worse, and they know it. The farmers and laborers who keep a civilization of 1,000,000 worlds fed and running through logistics that should be impossible. The people who pray to him not because they are forced to, but because the act of praying to something that represents hope, in a galaxy that provides very little hope from any other direction, gives them a way to keep going. And he did not engineer these people. He imposed conditions on them. They made themselves into what they needed to be under those conditions. And there is something in that capacity, in that specifically human quality of endurance and adaptation, that is not his creation, but that he might feel something about, for the first time in a very long time. The question of whether he is still capable of feeling things in that human sense, whether what returns from the throne has retained the capacity to be moved, to be made sad or glad or angry by individual encounters rather than just by strategic assessments, is the question at the center of everything. If it has not, then what returns is a very powerful engine for human survival. With insufficient connection to the individual humans it is surviving. The Imperium has been that already. More of the same is not obviously better. If it has, if the 10,000 years have taken an enormous toll, but not that specific one, then what returns is the most formidable combination of capability and conscience in the galaxy's history. A being who has had the longest possible time to understand what he did wrong, who is under no illusions about the cost of his choices, and who is standing in the ruins of everything he built, with both the power to do something about it, and finally, the willingness to be honest about why it became ruins. That honesty would be unprecedented. It would also, in the short term, be genuinely destabilizing, because an emperor who says clearly, "I know what this cost. I know where I failed. I know that my certainty about my own vision caused damage I should have prevented. Let us work together, now, with those failures understood." The emperor requires every institution that has been built on his infallibility to make an immediate and profound adjustment. And institutions do not make profound adjustments gracefully or quickly, but they might. In the long run, with time and with his presence guiding the adjustment rather than leaving it to drift, they might. Section 9. War Without End. The military picture transforms. Let us talk about the parts of this scenario that translate most directly into the question people in the 40K community most often reach for first. What does an awake emperor mean for the wars? As the emperor is the greatest military strategist in the history of the human species, and that statement requires unpacking rather than just accepting. He conducted the Great Crusade personally across 2 centuries and thousands of worlds. He brought world after world of human civilization back into the fold, against opposition ranging from alien empires to warlord kingdoms to the remnant horrors of the Age of Strife. He created the Primarchs not just as sons, but as generals, each one specialized in a different facet of strategic and tactical excellence that reflected a quality he saw as essential to the range of challenges the Crusade would face. He understood war not merely as a science of logistics and geometry, which he mastered completely, but as an art of human motivation and will, which he understood even better. He did this across the full breadth of his experience, which by the time of the heresy extended to roughly 40,000 years of recorded history and a considerable length of unrecorded history before that. 10,000 more years of fighting the Chaos Gods in the warp has not made him less capable of strategic thought. It has added a form of experience that no other being in the physical universe has. He has spent those centuries in direct, sustained psychic conflict with 4 of the most powerful and ancient entities in existence, learning their natures from the inside of the fight, understanding how they work in a way that no tactical database or strategium report could provide. When he returns and begins assessing the strategic picture of the 41st millennium, he is not doing so as a commander who has been asleep for 10,000 years and needs to catch up. He is doing so as a being who has been fighting continuously in the most fundamental war in the galaxy's history, who now has the additional perspective of being able to look at the physical dimension again. The most immediate tactical implication of his return is the simplest to state and the most difficult to fully visualize. His psychic power, no longer entirely consumed by the demands of the throne, is now available in other ways. We have seen what this power looks like at its most constrained. During the Plague Wars, when Robuta Guilliman was dying to Mortarion's blade in what appeared to be a genuinely terminal situation, something intervened. Something struck Mortarion, a demon Primarch who had survived 10,000 years of empowerment by one of the Chaos Gods, who has been described as one of the most dangerous entities that can be fielded in real space. With a psychic blow so comprehensive that he fled into his own pocket of the warp trailing smoke and injury. That was the Emperor at his most limited, most depleted, using power he could barely spare through a chain of events that required significant Eldari involvement to even become possible. An Emperor freed from the throne is not that. An Emperor freed from the throne is the thing that erased Horus's soul so completely that the 4 Chaos Gods working together could not reconstruct enough of it to resurrect their champion. He is operating at a level that makes the previous statement as staggering as it is, and a lower bound rather than an upper limit. But raw psychic firepower, as extraordinary as it would be, is not the most significant military contribution his return offers. The most significant contribution is coordination. The Imperium fights 1,000 wars simultaneously across 1,000,000 worlds, and the fundamental strategic challenge of those wars has never been a shortage of individual courage or individual capability. It has been coordination. It has been the inability of any command structure to hold enough information simultaneously at the necessary quality to make strategic decisions at the scale the galaxy requires. Guilliman's Indomitus crusade has been pushing hard against this problem, reforming the command structures of the Astra Militarum, deploying Primaris Space Marines with new strategic flexibility, and trying to bring the various arms of the Imperium into something approaching coherent action. He has made real progress. He has not had the authority or the information or the sheer scope of awareness to do it at the scale required. The Emperor has all 3 of those things. An Emperor who can speak directly, who can communicate with every strategically significant mind in the Imperium simultaneously through a combination of astropathy and direct psychic contact, who has the full strategic picture in a way that the distributed, necessarily partial information available to any institutional command structure cannot match. This is an Imperium that fights with something closer to intentional coordination than it has since the Great Crusade. The demon Primarchs represent the most pressing immediate concern in the physical conflict. As Mortarion in the warp, having already been struck once by the Emperor's power from the throne. Magnus the Red, whose relationship with his father is the most complexly painful in the entire heresy narrative. The son who fell because he loved his father too much, and in the wrong way, who has spent 10,000 years in the Chaos God's service, and yet who the lore consistently hints has not entirely extinguished something of the man he was. Angron, whose tragedy is possibly the most pure. A warrior who was forced into perpetual pain by neural implants that drove him to bloodlust, who was made into what he became not by a moment of choice, but by a life of agonizing compulsion. Jew who has been a demon Primarch of Khorne for so long that recovery is probably not meaningfully possible. but whose specific case represents one of the Emperor's most clear failures of care towards someone who needed intervention much earlier and much more urgently than he received it. Then there are the complicated cases, the Alpha Legion twins, Alpharius and Omegon, whose motivations have always been the most ambiguous in the entire Chaos Space Marine canon. The pre-heresy Alpha Legion apparently believed, based on a prophecy from the mysterious Xenos called the Cabal, that the best way to defeat Chaos in the long run was to ensure that Horus won the heresy, destroying the Imperium and severing humanity's connection to Chaos before the relationship became permanent. It is not clear that the heresy played out in the way they intended. Yes, it is not clear that either twin is fully committed to Chaos in the way the other traitor Primarchs are. The Emperor's return might do more to change the calculus for the Alpha Legion than for any other traitor force in the galaxy. And Magnus, always Magnus, a Primarch who fell not through ambition or corruption or the seduction of power for its own sake, but through a specific, desperate, loving act that went catastrophically wrong, and who has spent 10,000 years as Tzeentch's greatest servant, carrying the specific knowledge that his fall destroyed the one thing he cared most about protecting. What does Magnus do when his father wakes? What does the Emperor say to Magnus? These are not questions that resolve simply or cleanly, but they are questions that might now have the possibility of being asked directly, face to face, rather than carried forever as the unresolved grief of absence. On the structural military side, the webway, the Emperor's original dream, sealed away for 10,000 years, the portal beneath the palace protected by nothing more than his continuous presence. With him freed from the throne, the nature of that seal changes. It is no longer the only possible solution. It becomes a problem to be properly engineered, rather than indefinitely sustained by personal sacrifice. If the engineering problem can be solved, and with Call, and with the Emperor's own knowledge, and potentially with Aeldari cooperation, the webway reopens as a genuine strategic option. An Imperial war machine that can move through the webway rather than the warp would be unrecognizable compared to what currently exists. So the Imperium's primary strategic disadvantage has always been the sheer size of the space it needs to defend, combined with the time it takes to move forces across that space. Webway access changes that equation so fundamentally that describing it as a force multiplier barely does justice to the scale of the transformation. The wars would not end. The wars in 40K do not end, but they would change in every dimension that matters, in ways that would not have been conceivable before. There is one figure in the physical confrontation that deserves specific attention beyond the demon Primarchs, and that is Abaddon, the Despoiler. Ezekiel Abaddon was first captain of the Lunar Wolves Legion, Horus Lupercal's most trusted lieutenant, the greatest mortal warrior of his age by most assessments. But after the Horus heresy, he refused the transformation his master had undergone. He refused to become a demon prince, to trade his individual will for immortality of a kind that would make him a tool of the Chaos Gods, and spent 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, becoming something arguably more dangerous than a demon prince. A mortal man of extraordinary will, who has spent 100 centuries mastering himself, mastering the Chaos powers without being fully consumed by them, and planning 14 Black Crusades. Each one a massive military operation designed as much to achieve specific long-term strategic objectives as to cause immediate damage. The destruction of Cadia, the opening of the Great Rift. Every major action Abaddon has taken has been part of a plan whose full scope took 10,000 years to execute. Yet he is not a warlord who charges at problems with overwhelming force and hopes for the best. He is a strategist of the first rank who has been working towards specific, identified, sequenced goals with a patience that puts most so-called immortal beings to shame. He has contingency plans for the Emperor's potential return. This is not speculation. It is a near certainty given who Abaddon is, how he thinks, and what he has demonstrated over 10,000 years of operation. The question is not whether those plans exist, but what they look like. Does he believe he can win a direct confrontation with a fully restored emperor? Almost certainly not. Does he believe he needs to? Almost certainly not. Which what he believes, what his entire track record of tactical thinking suggests he would believe, is that the transition period is the window that matters. The weeks and months between the emperor first stirring and the emperor fully consolidating his awareness of the current situation represent a window of maximum opportunity. Awakening emperor, who has not yet rebuilt his full connection to the Imperium's structures, who is still absorbing what 10,000 years have produced, who is managing internal crises as much as external threats. This emperor is more vulnerable than one who has had years to settle back into active command. Every day that the emperor needs to consolidate is a day Abaddon can use to make that consolidation harder. His response to the awakening is therefore likely to be immediate, targeted, and sophisticated in ways that a simple assault on terror would not be. Not an attempt to destroy the emperor directly. That has failed before, at the highest possible cost, and Abaddon is not someone who repeats failed strategies. An attempt to deny the emperor the things he needs in order to become effective. Command structures disrupted, key individuals killed or captured. Strategically critical worlds threatened in ways that force the reallocation of resources away from consolidation and toward emergency defense. The Primarchs, perhaps. If Abaddon can reach any of them in that first vulnerable period, removing one of the Emperor's most significant military assets while simultaneously denying the emotional and strategic resource that each living Primarch represents. This is the adversary the Emperor would wake to face on the physical plane, not a chaos deity, not a demon Primarch, a mortal human being of extraordinary intelligence and 10,000 years of dedicated preparation, who has been thinking about this moment for longer than most civilizations have existed. Section 10. The Galaxy Watches. Every power recalculates the Imperium's internal upheaval is only one layer of the cascade. Beyond human space, every significant power in the galaxy has something at stake in the Emperor's return, and every one of them will respond in ways that reflect their own natures and their own long-term calculations. The craft-world Eldari, the Asuriani, the Ancient, the carefully disciplined remnant of a civilization that once dominated the galaxy for millions of years, and that is now dying by slow attrition, its craft worlds scattered across space like lifeboats from a ship that sank 60 million years ago, occupy a fascinating and deeply uncomfortable position relative to this event. They have cooperated with the Imperium across the millennia in ways both overt and invisible to the humans involved. Their farseers, the most accomplished precognitive seers in the galaxy, have been running calculations about the Emperor's potential return for at least as long as there has been an Imperium to worry about. They were involved in Gilliman's resurrection in ways that were not accidental, and that served Eldari interests as clearly as they served Imperial ones. Eldrad Ulthran, the Fasir of Ulthwé Craftworld, and the longest-lived and most experienced individual Farseer in the setting, has been managing the Eldari's relationship with Imperium-adjacent events for tens of thousands of years. He is not caught off guard by the Emperor's stirring. He may, in ways that were possible before the event because of his precognitive gifts, have already been in the process of responding. The Eldari response to the Emperor's waking will not be straightforward support because the Eldari do not offer straightforward support to anyone. It will be the specific form of assistance that benefits the Eldari at least as much as humanity, while being framed as a mutual interest, which it genuinely is, but not quite in the way it will be presented. The Inari, the followers of Inead, she's the Eldari god of the dead who has been slowly accumulating the souls of deceased Eldari across the millennia in preparation for a birth that might finally give the Eldari a weapon against Slaanesh, have their own complicated relationship with the Emperor's return. Ivrain, the emissary of Inead, was instrumental in bringing Gilliman back from his near death on Macragge. The Inari see themselves as participants in the reshaping of the galaxy's destiny rather than observers of it. An awakening Emperor changes the shape of what reshaping is possible. The Necrons, the ancient robotic race that was once the Necrontyre, us organic beings who surrendered their physical forms to the C'tan star gods in exchange for immortality and received it in the form that perhaps they should have been more careful to specify, present one of the most strategically interesting external reactions. The Silent King Sarek, having spent millions of years in extragalactic exile after freeing his people from the C'tan's direct control, and then leaving out of guilt over what his choices had cost them, returned to the galaxy with the understanding that the Tyranids represent an extinction-level threat to all life. Even the undying need organic life to persist if they want a galaxy that has anything meaningful in it. He has been working toward the development of a broad anti-Tyranid coalition, which has led to unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable conversations between Necrons and Imperials and Aldari. The Emperor's return, in Sarek's calculation, matters primarily in terms of what it changes about the available tools for fighting the Tyranid invasion. The Silent King does not feel about the Emperor the way humans feel about the Emperor, or the way Chaos feels about the Emperor. He makes strategic assessments, and his strategic assessment of an awakened Emperor who redirects the Imperium toward more coherent anti-Tyranid posture would likely be net positive, though the simultaneous intensification of the Astronomican's signal, which we will come back to momentarily, complicates that assessment significantly. The Orcs, the wonderful, terrible, endlessly escalating Orcs, a species built as biological weapons by the long-dead Old Ones, who have been the most numerically overwhelming source of conflict in the galaxy for millions of years, and who respond to everything above a certain threshold of importance through the collective psychic gestalt that pervades their entire species at a level below conscious awareness. Orc Weird Boys, the involuntary conduit psychers of the Orc species who channel that collective energy whether they want to or not, would feel the Emperor's stirring as a massive psychic event in the background noise they are always swimming in. The practical consequence of this, processed through the Orc species' essentially binary relationship with the world, is that the Emperor waking up means bigger fights are coming. Bigger fights are better. Every Orc in the galaxy, yet from the most powerful warboss commanding millions of warriors to the smallest Gretchen scraping along the bottom of the warchief hierarchy, benefits from the existence of bigger fights. The entire species will orient toward that signal the way flowers orient toward light. The Tyranids are the issue that requires the most careful consideration. The hive fleets, those vast extragalactic swarms of bioengineered organisms directed by the collective intelligence called the hive mind, have been attracted to the galaxy by the light of the Astronomican. This is established law. The psychic beacon that guides Imperial warships through the warp is, in the most unfortunate possible metaphor, like a flame that certain organisms in the darkness cannot help but move toward. What the intensity of this Astronomican signal correlates directly with the strength of the hive mind's interest in the destination. An Emperor who wakes up almost certainly produces an Astronomican that burns brighter and cleaner, and farther than at any point in the last 10,000 years. The strategic implications of that for the Tyranid threat are not subtle and are not good. It is one of the central paradoxes of this scenario. The thing that is best for human civilization's internal stability and coordination, the Emperor's full psychic engagement with the beacon, may also be what accelerates the timeline on the existential threat that represents the end of all life in the galaxy if it is not stopped. Any strategic council advising the Emperor in those first days would need to address this directly and urgently. The Tau, the young and idealistic species of the Eastern Fringe, would watch with a combination of practical concern and philosophical curiosity. Concern because a more coherent Imperium, with direct Imperial leadership, is a more dangerous Imperium from the perspective of any neighbouring polity, and the Tau's expansion has been possible in large part because the Imperium has been too distracted and disorganized to prioritize stopping it. Philosophical curiosity, because
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.